Why is there such a persistent presence in the imagination of Western thinkers about Islam?
The West, since the inception of Islam, needed to identify themselves as not.
For Western philosophy to survive, there needs to be a malign intent in erasing this Islamic philosophy and contribution.
Muslims oftentimes have been described as monsters and represented as monsters in the Western imagination. The need of defining as if Islam never happened, but it did.
Figures like Voltaire or Montesquieu admired bits of Islam, parts of Islam, but often reduced it to like an exotic caricature.
The West, without Islam, does not have a definition.
Dr. Francesca, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum salam, thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us, and I think today we're having another really important conversation, and that's a conversation about the West and Islam and how the West imagined Islam, especially historically, post-Dark Ages, and how the West interacted with Islam. And today we're going to, I suppose, engage with a number of Western thinkers and how they viewed Islam and whether there was a malign or not so malign pretext or context behind their understandings of Islam. But I suppose the first question to ask you is that why? Like, why is there such a persistent presence in the imagination of Western thinkers about Islam?
I think that there is a natural asymmetry between how Islam sees the West and how the West sees Islam. And the reason is that Islam sees itself in its imagination as the natural continuation of the Abrahamic narration. And so it can then proceed and go on freely. On the other hand, the West has, since the inception of Islam, needed to identify themselves as not the Muslims.
Really?
So while nowadays ideologies many times claim that Islam is incompatible in its nature to the West, what I claim is that the West without Islam does not have a definition. And there are some books, for example, Muslims in the West Imagination, a recent book that describes how Muslims oftentimes have been described as monsters and represented as monsters in the Western imagination because they had to be the other, the opposite.
That's fascinating because, of course, when we think about Western tradition, or at least in the common conversations we have about Western tradition, there isn't really an overt discussion today about framing the West and Western philosophy in the context of Islam. So I don't know, we'll think about the Westphalian Treaty or the birth of the nation state, or, you know, we engage with, at least from a British perspective, Locke or Hobbes or some of these traditional philosophers that developed the contours, I suppose, of Western philosophy. There isn't like a conversation about Islam, but your argument is that Islam is embedded within the language of what it means to be Western. Is that fair to say?
Yes, indeed. And there has been a removal from consciousness of it. And
Really?
This removal does not stem from Islam being incompatible with the West, but with a choice of what to translate, what to transmit, what to talk about, which authors to remember, and even which names to give to things. There are many things, for example, that in the West come from the Muslim world directly or indirectly, and they're not given the name of their discoverer, their founder, or things that have been rediscovered anew, as if Islam never existed, as if this civilization was never there. And this talks on the unconscious of Europe about a fundamental fear about the need of defining themselves as if Islam never happened. But it did, and we are here. So what are we going to do about it?
I suppose it begs the question, why? Why would, 15th century, 16th century Western thinkers and philosophers and artists, why would they be thinking deeply about Islam? What's going on?
Well, on one level, they were. In fact, if one goes back to many scientific works, for example, Copernicus, he actually cites Muslim scientists in his work as if that was natural. And many medieval authors and even of later centuries did cite Islamic authors, but it never became a clear connection between them and their Islamic counterpart in the later rereading. Because of course we know that the history of science is not a neutral subject as is as science itself. So there is a narrative about it, as if it's the one of individual, the one of genius, the one of these people that came out of the Dark Ages. And the narrative of the Dark Ages is also problematic for us, because it tells us that the West almost was not there for a while, and then it emerged. And this emergence has nothing to do with Islam in this narrative, of course.
Okay, so let's begin with Dante. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, places the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Prophet Muhammad, and Ali bin Abi Talib in hell, while Salahuddin and Averroes are resting in limbo. I mean, how do we interpret this mix of condemnation on the one hand and admiration in the Christian imagination of Islam?
This was ever present in the Christian imagination until the world became post-Christian. Wow. And then there was removal. But in the medieval world and in the Christian world, Islam has always been there. And Dante's view is not extraordinary concerning Islam. It's very typical for a man of his age and of his time. Yeah. So Islam is seen by him as a heresy. What it means that it is part of the same history. And therefore it is more dangerous, because a heresy and the choice of the Prophet ﷺ and Ali shows also how the Sunni-Shia split was seen in the medieval imagination as branches of what we as Westerners could have been, but were not. So we need to get removed from that. At the same time, the usefulness of Islamic knowledge is acknowledged, and therefore these thinkers are in the limbo. But why are they there? Because they have transmitted something. And this is a very dangerous idea, because the Muslim world only exists and is only useful and positive as a bridge to bring us something. And there are exceptions. For example, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi is placed also in the limbo and is not a thinker per se. Yeah. So also in the medieval world, of course, the recognition of virtues, for example, was important. Yeah. So the example of chivalry wouldn't go unnoticed. But this type of reading of Islam was very common in the West. The idea it is something that we could have been, but we're not. We need to defend ourselves to not become like them, and the fear associated with it, yet the usage of their knowledge because it was advanced.
I remember reading a quote from Voltaire where he says that Muhammad was an impostor, but a wise and mighty one. I mean, figures like Voltaire or Montesquieu, they admired bits of Islam, parts of Islam, but often reduced it to like an exotic caricature. How did Enlightenment thinkers both praise and distort the faith of Islam?
The Enlightenment is a very interesting case study, because what it claims to be is to be a complete break with tradition. Right. Yet what we see concerning Islam is that there is a striking continuity with what people have been saying since the Middle Ages. So, for example, Voltaire and Montesquieu, they satirize some aspect that they observe while not observing Islam, because neither of them has a direct knowledge, right? And
so they didn't study Islam in any great depth.
No. All these thinkers actually got their knowledge from Islam from encyclopedias. That was the Enlightenment was famous for, this encyclopedic work that included all religions of the world and all things, and one could pick and choose. And this is, again, beginning of a very dangerous idea we have in the West, and that we can have a look at all knowledge, like served on a platter of some sort of clear explanation or encyclopedic knowledge, and then choose bits and pieces as if we were a higher position, as if we are the judge of humanity, of the world. And this is a dangerous colonial attitude, basically. But going back to Voltaire, there is this strange play that he wrote at a certain point in his life, which is Le Fanatisme Mahomet, in which he tells the story of the Prophet ﷺ, and of course it's not his story, it has nothing to do with it. And it was a play that it was meant to criticize the church. In fact, he even asked the Pope at a certain point if he could dedicate it to him as a sort of mockery towards the church. Right. But at the same time, Islam is used as, again, the monster, the one we could have been, but we choose not to be. So it's exactly the same dynamic of Dante once over again.
Yeah. Renan, Ernest Renan, famously declares Islam the complete negation of Europe. Why was this idea of Islam as a fanatical faith, as Voltaire or Renan, sort of negation of Europe, why did this have currency at the time and beyond that time?
Yes, I think that Renan, even if he comes much later, it's 1883, so a lot of time has passed. We are again stuck in the same narrative, and this is incredible from the West, how little it has tried to reanalyze its position in relationship to Islam from a cultural and philosophical and literary point of view. And Renan is a problem from many sides, because what he says in his lesson is that Islam is the negation of Europe. And we have already talked about it, that maybe it's Europe that's the negation of Islam, not the other way around. But he also says that Islam is intrinsically enemy to science.
Really?
And this stereotype, then it's perhaps at this point, the breakage, where the West stopped seeing Islam as the civilization which anyway produced great scientists, produced great philosophers, and removed it from its own consciousness. In fact, it's the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of changes are going on also at other layers, other aspects. In fact, we can even see in the Muslim responses to this that they are very weak, not well argumented, and they couldn't really tackle the point.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Mazen Mukhtar, the CEO of Baitulmaal. The month of Muharram is the first month of the year and one of the 4 sacred months mentioned in the Quran. It is a time of reflection and remembrance and recommitment to faith. Let us turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this month and seek His mercy through charity. You can provide emergency aids, you can provide food, clean water, shelter, education to families who pray for relief. May Allah accept their prayers through the compassion of our donors through you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I know that Jamal al-Afghani, he responds to that claim by Renan. How did Afghani respond to it in your mind, in an apt way, in an appropriate way? How did he respond to that?
So his rebuttal was very passionate, but I think it was not able to see things outside from the box of his time and age.
Really?
So it was a defense. It was a defense to an accusation, which is untrue, though. And so he said that although, yes, the church as well was an enemy to science. What kind of a defense is that if it is not true that Islam is an enemy to science? So it then started this whole complex that many Muslims had in the early modernity of demonstrating how Islam, in theory, would be a friend to science, as if in practice it wasn't, but it was. So there is a big conflict on how Muslims see their own history, how they read their own history, and sometimes in defending ourselves, we actually fall prey to the same stereotypes that the accusers have towards us.
Why? Why did that complex exist amongst Muslims of that early modernity, early time of modernity?
It is difficult to explain it. Decolonial scholars would call it the narrative that there is in the West nowadays, and sometimes we have imported that too. So we sometimes see ourselves as the villains in someone else's superhero story to make things simple, yet we are not that. Islam is its own thing, and this is something which sounds so obvious. But to be honest, in literature and philosophy and culture, there aren't many people that have really given Islam the dignity it deserves as a religion, as a people, as a philosophy, as a culture, and all of them together.
Right. Gramsci. I studied Gramsci at university, and, he's a very useful thinker, and he talks about hegemony and, power, and these are really interesting terms, especially when we're trying to deal with the war on terror and some of the language associated with it. But I'm also struck by Gramsci's statement that Islam is a religion of desert people, and these broad claims that Muslims are fatalistic. How do we weigh these generalizations from people who are, who we could regard as being quite sympathetic, actually, to some of our causes when it comes to their depiction and understanding of Islam?
I think that one of the key words is the word you have used, is useful. So this thought can be useful, but sometimes it's not useful. And with dealing with foreign thoughts and ideas and Islamic culture, we have always done that. We do not have a problem to engage with them. And we take what is wise and leave the rest. Of course, until a certain point, there are thinkers that I believe, like Michel Foucault, are too wretched to even deal with, so I completely abandon them. But in the case of Gramsci, as long as we see him as a son of his time, anyway, was an Italian of a certain period of time, and of course he's going to have a blind spot for really giving other people the dignity that they deserve, and we have to acknowledge it, we can still use their concepts. However, we have a problem sometimes in Islamic studies and Muslims discovering these thinkers and embracing their views a bit too much. That's perhaps the cause also of Edward Said, who uses Gramscian worldview a lot. And sometimes we become a bit enamored with these people without knowing their culture, their context, and these blind spots that they have. So they were human beings, so they couldn't see the whole picture. And they're missing out what comes from their culture, from their time. And so Gramsci indirectly admits that he doesn't know a lot about Islam. So when he talks about the Weltanschauung, the vision of the world that religions have, he said, well, Islam must be like Judaism, like Christianity, but he doesn't know. So let's keep that in mind and use what is useful.
I mean, so far, when you talk about Voltaire or Gramsci or others, it seems like there is a willing ignorance rather than anything malicious. Is there anything you're thinking that implies that there is an acknowledgement of Islam and its scientific and cultural heritage and richness, but in order for Western philosophy and modernity to survive, there needs to be a denunciation or a malign intent in erasing this Islamic philosophy and contribution to modern thought?
This is very hard to answer because I don't know how much of it is intentional and how much of it isn't.
Yeah.
Looking in particular at the Italian context, I can say that there is a lot of subconscious projection going on. For example, we have very famous scholars like Francesco Gabrieli talking about Islam. He was an Arabist, he knew the language, so finally someone knowing the language, speaking about the religion. Yet when he talks about Islam in his books, and they're still used at university level in Italy, he says, well, Islam is a religion of the past. Like it doesn't exist anymore. Right. And I think it's very striking telling to someone living in Britain from the Muslim community, which is very much alive and well. Yeah. Yet, in some parts of Europe, and in all Italian books you would find on Islam, mostly written by this type of scholars, they would say things like, yeah, Islam had a great poetry and it's a finished story. Right. And this anxiety of saying that Islam is over, perhaps it betrays a bit of a malicious intent, but I cannot know that. However, nowadays that we have the language, the ability to really analyze things as they are, I think that it should be stated to Western philosophers that, Islam is there, is a thing, it's alive. We have to keep it in mind.
I have a good number of non-Muslim viewers, and they may be surprised at your response there, because I remember reading a book, and I can't remember the author's name immediately, but it's a book, After Empire. And he looks at Catholicism and Islam and I think another faith and argues that Muslims have to realize that the glory days are over of the caliphate, of progress in science and technology. But you seem to imply that actually that type of attitude or that acknowledgement, maybe from his perspective, that Islam has to pass the baton on maybe to Western culture, Western civilization. We shouldn't think like that. I mean, just expand on that to me. Why should we not believe and remain good Muslims wedded to our spiritual beliefs? Why shouldn't we believe that Islam's best days are over?
Well, I think that, first of all, we have to request to people that are analyzing our tradition to realize that we are here. We're alive, we're well, we're believing in what we're believing, certainly so. We're practicing what we're believing, certainly so. And we are transmitting our knowledges. And this might seem marginal, but a type of knowledge like the ijaza system, so a direct transmission that we have, and when we study theology, we studied from someone who studied from someone who studied from the author, has the potential of reviving at any time. To the Islamic world, incredible boundaries have been put and incredible challenges in the last 100, 150 years. So these are mainly relating with colonialism, and now they're not there anymore. So what is avoiding us to really flourish again? I think sometimes either our own fears and sometimes a narrative that we have agreed on that says that we're dead.
And so we shouldn't be so fatalistic when it comes to the future of Islam. I mean, I came across a scholar who said that maybe the best days of Islam are yet to come. I mean, is that an idea that you subscribe to?
Well, on the one hand, we know that in our ideas of the end of times, they're not the most brilliant times for humanity. But I think that sometimes we have generalized that from being an aspect relating to theology and faith to be an aspect related to other sciences such as politics, philosophy, literature, poetry.
Yeah.
Who said we cannot revive that? So let us try to be optimistic, which is one of our key virtues, right, in Islam. And let us not take someone else's like death wish as our own reality, and at least examine things as they are.
Great. And of course, you're Italian, and in the 1930s, there was a proposal by Benito Mussolini to open a masjid in Rome to mark the closeness between the Italian regime or fascism and Muslims. And I think he proclaimed himself to be a protector of the faith, a protector of Islam. Like, just tell me about that relationship between, at least in his mind, between himself, fascism and Islam.
I think that this is one of those stories that can really highlight how sometimes propaganda can become something we believe in without the necessary precautions. Right. So we have this story in which in 1937, Mussolini wants to have a propaganda moment in which he gets gifted the sword of Islam. If you never heard about the sword of Islam, it's because it doesn't exist. And it was made in Florence, actually, by the Picchiani and Barlacchi jewelry, which is still active, I think, today. Yes. And Mussolini asked them, please make us a sword of Islam so we can have it. And what he did is that he got some marginal tribe leader to gift it to him and to have this great proclaim that this honor was gifted to him. And that's nothing new in politics. Napoleon tried to do some similar PR stunts as well. We know that. And however, this attempt to get close to Islam has to be seen through the lens of colonial domination of places like Libya, where seeing Mussolini as a protector would have crashed the resistance. And however, things were not as easy. In fact, his proposal of opening this mosque in the 30s, well, the mosque was not opened, and it took until 1995, and it wasn't opened by the Italian government, but by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And if you go to Rome, and you need to find that mosque, well, it's quite outside of town. So the symbol of having a mosque in Rome, the city of the church, is still not really there, although there is a mosque in Rome. But
what about this? The claim, I suppose that was implicit in his language, where that there is Islam and fascism are natural bedfellows. And again, you see that today. I mean, you know, there are some who claim that the authoritarianism that we're seeing across Europe or with Donald Trump, that best reflects some of Islam's sociological and political beliefs. And like, how would you engage with that understanding?
Yes, this is a very strange idea that fascism would be an ally of Islam, because first of all, well, the main Islamophobes that we are seeing right now are really the fascists or the more right-wing type of extremists, so that would be strange. But further on, we shouldn't forget that the myth of like the Nazis being closed to the Mufti of Jerusalem was actually Israeli propaganda. And why was that created? Well, it was created in order for people in the West to believe that the Jewish state and the Christians were natural allies. So let's exclude Islam. We have to exclude Islam. Again, once more, we have to take Islam and define ourselves as not being that. So let us not forget that in reality, what happened was the King of Morocco helping the Jews, was the Mosque of Paris helping the Jews during the Holocaust. And there was no such alliance. It really wasn't a thing. And if we think about it in abstract political science terms, well, fascism is a secular ideology. It is ultra-nationalistic. These are all things which, as Muslim, we naturally tend to dislike. And that many times the claim of Muslim being naturally despotic was actually a tool for colonial domination, not a point for an alliance, but a point for destruction and threat.
I think it was Rousseau, maybe, who referred to Islam as the Oriental despot, or Islamic history as Oriental despot. There is even some Muslims I come across, they do argue that, look, the history of the caliphate is one of a strong man and one of sort of total control and a totalizing impact upon society and the sort of society working in a singular direction. I mean, is there a problem with Muslims communicating that maybe natural, we would say not, but natural sort of connection between authoritarianism and Islam?
Yes, let us not forget that fascism is an ultra power of the state. And the weight that we give to the state and the thickness the state has to have in Islam as very different than what the nation state looks today.
Right.
So even though some could argue, but I do not argue, that the caliphate was a strong man, how strong was really he? I mean, how many things could he control with the state? How many things could he fund? How many things did he have a control over? Did he have a control over the whole educational system? No. The health system? No. Infrastructures? No, because there was the awqaf system. So even if we agree with that, and I do not, because of the power of the wizirs, the power of the court, many types of power were there.
So even the power of the ulama and the power of these institutions were in a way tempered. They moderated the power of the Khalifa.
And it definitely never became a hyper-secularist, nationalist ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by it, but I know this is not the central conversation here, but, you know, it does link to, because, of course, we've internalized a lot of this criticism towards Islam and sometimes embrace some of these criticisms as being part of our belief system. You know, your argument is that you know, even any thought about reinventing or renaissance in thinking about Islamic political systems or about caliphates or about unification has to be very wary of the authenticity of our thinking when it comes to how these systems would look like.
Yeah, there is a lot that we're giving for granted, I think, nowadays in Islamic thought. And now moving a bit outside of my topic, because this is more political than philosophical or literary, but it is true that we're giving for granted the role of the state, we're giving for granted nation state or homogeneity of language or the role of the government. And all these things are actually something that ideologically it can be negotiated. Then in practice, that's another story. But at least we should be open in thought about recognizing what we can exist without all this apparatus.
Ivan Agueli coined the term Islamophobia in 1904 and spoke of three kinds of Islamophobia: clerical, racial, and rationalist. I mean, you know, that seems like language beyond before its time. Like how ahead of its time was this framework, and how do we still see these forces at work today?
Yeah, so Agueli was really a person with an incredible insight on Islam and culture, and he was actually writing this in an Italian newspaper, which was also published at the same time in Arabic in Egypt. So just to give an idea of how forward-thinking was really all this process. Yeah. And he said that he wrote it as a European criticizing other Europeans. So Islamophobia is a European thing. It's a thing for the Westerners. And it really reflects how nowadays it has divided. So we have the Christian clerical and still conservatives. And nowadays we have this phenomenon of the most conservative people not really being practices or clerical, but their ideology is the same. And the racist kind has evolved into xenophobia. But it is, again, the same characterization, stereotypes of race, of color, and then finally the secular kind, and we can see all the anti-religious Dawkins type of propaganda going on. So I think that Agueli really gives us a framework to understand the types of resistance and the type of aggression that we have towards Islam.
I mean, I was struck by, I came across an academic piece talking about John Locke, who I'm quite familiar with, and how his book on toleration, it gives a nod to and an echo to a toleration that he understood existed in Ottoman society. In the same way, scholars like Dante, which we've already spoken about, some claim that he was influenced by Ibn Arabi and Islamic cosmology. Do you believe that? And does it suggest that Islam deeply shaped even critics of Islam?
Yes, I do believe there is a strong case for the Islamic sources of Dante, not only in the Divine Comedy. In fact, if one looks at the poetry of Dante and his poetry of love, it really sounds a lot like poetry you would find, for example, in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq by Ibn Arabi. Or the Monarchia, or about monarchy, really sounds a lot like Al-Farabi. And there have been scholars who have been writing about it. For example, Massimo Campanini, rahimahullah, in Italian, has written about it, and several other Italian authors claim for this. And as for the comedy, well, the teacher of Dante, Brunetto Latini, has been for a long time in contact with Islamic civilization. And there are some sources, maybe not Ibn Arabi directly, but some sources that talk about the Mi'raj of the Prophet ﷺ and imagine, recount the story in a way which is identical to it. Now, there are some authors, especially Italians, that try to claim that there is this sort of universal imagination, knowledge, and archetypes. However, if it was about any other culture, if not Islam, anybody would argue that this is a direct contamination. So, yes, Dante, as many other medieval scholars, was deeply influenced by Islam, and it is directly traceable to his sources too.
Earlier on, you talked about how Western science, in a way, has got a lot to acknowledge from Islamic science, and European science in its early days really required the advancements of Muslim societies. I mean, why are these foundations marginalized still to today?
Yes, one of the key myths that this type of discussion goes against is the myth of the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Judeo-Christian roots of science, of what the West is today.
Right.
And if we look at famous scholars, for example, Fibonacci in the 13th century, we look at their biography while they studied in North Africa. And that was common because even a pope, perhaps, studied in Fez, and this is argued for, but it is said that Sylvester II, Gerbert d'Aurillac, actually studied in Fez, and he knew about Islamic theology. Yeah. Certainly, he knew Arabic, and it's not very common nowadays for a Westerner to do.
Yeah.
Copernicus, as we said, was informed by Arabic scholars, and we have already, at the year 1000, a lot of translation, where this guy, Gerard of Cremona, he translated over 70 books into Latin. Yet, to find an Italian translation of the Quran, you have to wait until the year 1500. So there has been quite a lot of gatekeeping there. However, we have point of contacts. We have, for example, Frederick II, the Christian king of Sicily, who had conversations with Muslim theologians and asked them questions and had Muslims at his court writing poetry. And we have some other relationships which are not so direct, but perhaps the fact that Galileo and his scientific method is actually the same reworking of Ibn al-Haytham and his scientific method. So even if there isn't a direct connection there, why not to call it the Ibn al-Haytham method, for example?
Right. Okay. But they neither. There's just not a single conversation really in the public consciousness about that heritage.
Well, there starts to be a bit in the English-speaking world. Yeah, for example, in my subject being psychology, in all books on the history of psychology for University of Sin in English, German, or Italian, it is always said psychology is born in the year 1879 by Wundt in Germany. But that's simply not the case, because there have been labs of psychology before. There have been Muslim psychologists and Arabic psychologists. So in most disciplines, it is like that.
Tell me about Pico della Mirandola and his contribution to busting this myth that there is a Judeo-Christian world.
Yes, I love the figure of Pico because he was someone who's very well known in the West for being a person who had an incredible amount of knowledge and could synthesize, with his memory already was prodigious, really amounts of information which were inaccessible to others. And so he chose what to take in, what to make of his models, and he actually directly cites Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, Ibn Bajjah, the great thinkers that were available at the time. Another reason why Pico is so important is that he was very interested in this idea from Islamic theology, which is like the chain of being from Al-Ghazali and human freedom. And eventually, he starts writing about it. He writes an Oratio, De Hominis Dignitate, so about dignity of human being. This is so influential because then it goes through Erasmus of Rotterdam to De Montaigne, Kant, Locke, all these line of thinkers which we recognize as having no impact with Islam. They have nothing to do with it. Of course, they are purely Westerners, yet their teachers, their inspirations. We can never go back to a point where there is no Islamic influence in the Western thought.
Even with scholars who've accepted the roots of Western civilization have some part to play in Islamic knowledge, there is very rarely a acceptance of Islamic spirituality. I mean, why this double standard when it comes to looking at Islamic heritage when approaching Western civilization?
I think that part of it is a fruit of the Western Christian experience.
Right.
And so the West is not born out of a bubble. It is born of its own history. And its own history, it's a very painful history of religious wars and a very painful history of theology and philosophy trying to agree with each other, but not quite really. And this is a specific Western European problem. It is something that it has to deal with. Yet, as long as this mindset stays in place, as long as this becomes and still is a conflict, of course, the spiritual impact of Islam will be diminished because it is given for granted as a prejudice that spirituality has nothing to do with thought. But even Western thinkers that had nothing to do with Islam realized that this conflict is bringing us nowhere. One example is, for example, Martin Heidegger, which we know very much talking about metaphysics, and we know that at the earlier part of his life, he tried to divide his theology and his philosophy studies. His brother was a priest, and they have these letters talking about it. Yet, the last interview that he ever gave in his life, it is only one God can save us. So how is that? Let us try to follow what these thinkers had as an insight and as a view of what the West could be saved. So what the West could be without this dichotomy, this conflict within itself.
I know that you're a student of Goethe, and he talks about Islam in a very positive sense. In fact, if I remember, I think it was you who talked about this. He fasted in Ramadan, and he praised the Prophet ﷺ. If Islam means submission to God, God's will, then in Islam we all live and die, which is a very positive statement. Is that positive? Like, do we universally accept that, you know, there's a glimmer here of a Western thinker who very positively is engaging with Islam, and actually there is a claim that he became a Muslim. I mean, how valid is that claim?
Yeah, I strongly believe this. I strongly believe that he was a Muslim,
really?
yes. And this fascination he had with the Muslim world that is usually put down as romantic admiration. Right. But we can see that he did something that the other romantics did not do. And that's, of course, practicing Islam, that would be one thing. He met Islam at 21, where he read the Quran just to further his culture. Right. But he became enamored with it, to such a level that he wrote some theater plays that unfortunately I think are not available in English. It's the Mahometsgesang. It's a song of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It's beautiful love and admiration through it, as you would find in Sufi literature. I really love this. And he writes much more about Islam through his life. And the final fruit, just his last work before he died, is the Vestuslicher Divan. So this poetry collection, which is dedicated to the Quran. I mean, I don't know how more can you be explicit in what you're saying. And I'm not just saying this from his published work. I have went through all 143 volumes of his diaries, letters, and I have found more than 200 references to Islam in it. Yeah. And several of it are letters stating how he lived in Islam. And from the Divan, already in the published parts, if someone is interested in finding more, they can find the actual translation of the Basmala in German. They can find the translations of Quranic verses, as well as the fact that we all live and die in Islam.
But didn't Goethe rework, or at least translate, Voltaire's horrible play about Muhammad ﷺ, the fanatisme? How do we reconcile that with, you know, this conversion to Islam?
Yeah, I think that actually his reworking of this play shows how much he was a Muslim. Yeah. Because, well, first of all, he didn't choose to do it. He was forced by the Duke of Weimar, and of course he didn't have power on it. And so he wrote in his letters how much he hated translating it. And there are some letters which are really funny, as, please let me not do it. And the Duke is back telling him, yeah, I know you're a Muslim sympathizer, but please don't. And so he ends up translating, but he doesn't translate. He abridges a lot. So if one were to read the French and the German side to side, you would see that, of course, the horrible insults on the Prophet are all taken away.
Really?
And there are themes added. And these themes are Tawheed and revelation. And subhanAllah, they are really the key points of Islam, and the character of the Prophet is made much better, and the plot is changed, so the Prophet never has to lie in the German translation. So I think that, again, these are signs for people who understand, really.
Yeah, Leda Rafanelli called herself a Muslim, an anarchist, and a feminist, and even tried to introduce Mussolini, I think, to the faith. what did Islam mean to her, spiritually, politically, and philosophically? I mean, I've got a quote here from Leda. Islam affirmed the dignity of every human being in contrast to Europe's cruel hierarchies. So tell us a little bit about Rafanelli, please.
Yes, Leda is a beautiful figure, and she's part of a wider movement of people who in the year 1900 and further on, as anarchists, converted to Islam.
Really?
And of Italians,
How
there
widespread
were
was this?
not much, but among the elite, there are quite a few.
Okay.
So it wasn't a masses movement, but it was an intellectuals movement, let's call it. And she converted to Islam quite early. She was 20 years old in Egypt. And she does her best to study Arabic, to practice Islam. She's known to have dressed like an Arab in a certain way. She fasted during Ramadan as well. And she talks about how Islam is a superior worldview to the Western one all the time in her works, in her letters. Yet at the same time, she still is an anarchist. So it's quite a complicated figure.
Yeah.
And of Leda's, her heritage is... I'm really sad about it sometimes because it is either stressed that she was a feminist, although, right, in many of her works, she says, I really wish that there was an opportunity to marry like in the Muslim marriage with responsibility and commitment, which is quite a criticism to the free love that sometimes people associate with anarchy. Yeah. And even her relationship with Mussolini is quite interesting because she gifts him a Quran. He's not really interested and he falls in love with her. Okay. And she denies being his lover, even though, of course, this is before he was the leader of fascism, but still quite a charismatic and powerful man because she said that she wanted a relationship based on dignity, respect, and commitment. So very powerful figure.
So you've argued that Islam has been long present in the Western mind and admired intellectually, but possibly rejected spiritually and politically. Like, how do we move beyond the binary towards deeper integration and acknowledgement of the rich connections and melding of Islam into an Islamic thought into Western tradition?
I think there are, I'll start from two case studies.
Yeah.
The first case study is Muhammad Iqbal, the founding poet of Pakistan, where he takes most probably Dante's Divine Comedy and he reworks it in the Javednameh in a view of heaven and some of the condemned entities, but he does a change. So he never puts people in hell based on their names. And he says that it was Dante's mistake. So he takes from this tradition, he takes on it through art, and his poetry is great poetry on the technical side, and the poetics, it's amazing. Yet he also tries to remove what from the West could have been dangerous, so condemning people to hell by name. As Muslim, we don't do that. No. Another case study is that I was just recently in a primary school in Damascus, and there were kids that were memorizing and reciting poetry. And this poetry was rhyming poetry in which the children were playing the grape fruits which were given to the Prophet ﷺ after Ta'if. Okay, and they were interpreting them and developing love from the Prophet through this art and this incredible metaphysical understanding of things. So on the one hand, we engage with the West. On the other hand, we aren't afraid of our own way of understanding art and the deep spiritual impact it can have on us since we are children. Because we are completely so uneducated about art, literature, philosophy, poetry, that it comes to us as a shock when we are 18 or whatever we are, and we say this is the thing of the Westerners. We have nothing to do with it, or we try to do it and it doesn't come out really well, to be honest. So engagement. And engagement is not a thing of the muftis, right? We do not go and say this is haram, this is halal. Engagement is a thing of the artists that have to play a role. They have always played a role in our community. Okay. And at the same time, we should alphabetize our children and the younger generation to our intellectual heritage, because no Muslim child would want to become a poet if he doesn't know there are poets. So if he doesn't know how beautiful it can be, no Muslim child would become an artisan and preserve calligraphy if he doesn't know it is a thing. So let's keep these things alive, and that will be the best way to then engage with what is there from the Western tradition too.
I'm from East London. Poetry is far from my mind, Francesca. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Why shouldn't we think big, and why shouldn't we introduce our children to this rich heritage? One final question for you. If you were to revise one Western thinker and remember them in relation to Islam, like who would that be and why?
Yeah, an example for me before conversion, during and after, has always been Goethe. And there are many reasons for it, and I invite anybody to read his poetry to understand more of that. But there is one incident that comes to my mind. And there's once in Weimar, he heard that there was an envoy from the Ottomans, and that was time for prayer, and he could actually finally see someone praying. So he ran, and he could just see this person praying, and he writes in his diary as if the earth had opened and he was praying in the presence of God. But yet, we know that Goethe didn't really become like a faqih or didn't know Arabic too well. He actually had the Arabic Quran on his nightstand, but only at the end of his life could he figure out some words. And this is such an amazing example because it makes me think of that hadith in which there is the man coming to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asks him, when is the hour? And the Prophet says, what have you prepared for it? And he said, well, not much, but love for Allah and His Messenger. And the Prophet responds, that you will be with the ones you love. And I think that Goethe is such an example of that. And if we could bring back literature and art to be about that as Muslims, I think we could really change a lot of things.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a really engaging conversation, Dr. Francesca. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair for your time.
Thanks a lot, Wayak.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.